Welcome to Daily Plunge. We are in the first letter to the Corinthians from Paul. It starts off with Paul quoting their letter to him. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, this doesn't come from Paul. Paul says, you wrote this. And where did the Corinthians get it from? Well, they got it from some Greek philosophy that was all about denial of self. And Paul says, but since sexual immorality is occurring in your congregation, right? There is a problem with this in your church. I got a wild idea. How about you only have sex with your own spouse? Oh my gosh. And so here is the biblical admonition against wife swapping, right? He says that each man is to be with his wife. That is the boundary of marriage. And he goes on in verse 4 to say that the wife belongs to her husband, that he has authority over her, and she's to yield to him. Now, that wasn't earth-shaking because that's what that society assumed. But the next sentence, it is. And so too the husband belongs to his wife. She has authority over his body, and he is to yield himself to her. And what is this concept that Paul's talking about? It is one of, like he talks about in Ephesians chapter 5, that they submit to one another out of mutual love. And he says, don't deprive one another of sexual intimacy. Why? Because sexual intimacy is given to us as a gift from God, where it's hardwired into us physically, emotionally, and spiritually, so that when a husband and wife come together, they become one flesh, that there is this really sacred union that takes place. And he says the only time you shouldn't be giving yourself to one another is when by a mutual agreement, and the primary purpose being to be devoted to prayer and fasting. Now, Paul says in verse 6, this is not a command, right? I'm trying to give some guidance, some teaching. And then he goes on in verse 7, he says that only a few people have the gift of celibacy. And you have to understand, we understand biblically that marriage is a definite gift from God, created by God for humanity. And a few people, very few people, have the gift of celibacy. Why is that a gift? It's a gift so that they devote themselves wholly, fully to God without the worry of looking after a family. So he goes on, even though he says, I wish that all of you were like I am. You know, Paul's speaking off the cuff. And he goes on to the unmarried and the widows. He says, I would say to them, if they can stay unmarried, great. If not, they cannot control themselves, it is better to marry because of their passion. Well, what is their passion for? Their passion is for connection, relational connection, for relational intimacy, to be touched and not to be lonely. And, what does it mean to have a passion for your spouse, to burn for your spouse, to have an eagerness to love and care for them, to love beyond your own self, and to be excited for your spouse? And those are all gifts and blessings. And the more we're in prayer and in Scripture together as couples, the more we will have that blessing that comes from God rather than the delusions of sex that comes from society. Well, thanks, friends. Have a blessed day.